Hi, I'm Abby. I have a lot of records. And this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the series where once a week I sit down and talk about a classic album I love. If 30-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, both here on my channel and over on my Instagram. And welcome to the third and final part of the 1969 mini-series. For 3 weeks now, I have covered 3 massively influential records, all released within 6 weeks of each other in the fall of 1969. I believe all of these albums would, in some way, dictate how rock and roll in the 70s would go. Part 1 was the end of the Beatles with Abbey Road. Part 2 was the birth of prog rock with In the Court of the Crimson King. And Part 3 is a band that I've built this channel off of covering. One of my first 5 videos was a Zeppelin video. Houses of the Holy is one of the most viewed episodes of Vinyl Monday, and I feel like every time I talk about this group, it serves as a benchmark for how Vinyl Monday has grown and changed over the months. So, this week's album is Led Zeppelin II! Congrats to those who guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints for what next week's album is gonna be. I host polls over there. I keep account of how much I swear in each video. It's a fun time. Alright, let's take the plastic off. So my copy is a repress from 1977. There seems to have been a pretty wide reissuing of Zeppelin albums in that year. I got this for like $20 at a flea market. It sounds thoroughly okay. Not great, but not terrible. We cannot move through the most vinyl collector-centric section of my videos without talking about perhaps the holy grail of classic rock collecting, the Robert Ludwig hot mix of Led Zeppelin II. So Ludwig was in charge of mastering Zeppelin II for its initial release. The guys were familiar with his work, they trusted him to make this thing sound great, and he did. It's got this really rich and loud bass, high highs and low lows, crisp drums. It's a very high contrast mix. Maybe just a little too high contrast. The problem was, a lot of lower grade turntables, what Zeppelin's mostly teenage audience was using, couldn't handle this record. The teenage daughter of an Atlantic Records exec was the one to discover this. She put a brand new copy of Zeppelin II on her little turntable, nothing wrong with it at all, and this record was just too big to play on it. Atlantic realizes this could be a huge issue, stops the presses, and orders a different, quieter, lower contrast mastering for widespread commercial release. There's rips of the hot mix floating around on YouTube, and it really does sound that good, especially when you compare it to a copy like mine. Now let's talk about the cover art, which garnered Zeppelin II the nicknames of Brown, Big Brown, and Brown Bomber, which I always found kind of odd because in person, this looks a little pinkish. Was the guy who came up with that nickname colorblind? Am I colorblind? This art was by David Juniper, a buddy of Jimmy Page's. We have the Zeppelin guys edited into a vintage photo of a German Air Force division. We have some other faces replaced in here too. Opening up the gatefold, we have a big-ass illustration of a Zeppelin with the liner notes and track listing. On Led Zeppelin II, we have Robert Plant on vocals and harmonica, Jimmy Page on guitar and theremin, John Paul Jones on bass and Hammond organ, and John Bonham on drums. Jimmy is credited as the sole producer here. He had a different team of engineers working underneath him on each album, so they wouldn't end up in a Beatles and George Martin conundrum, so nobody could take credit for Zeppelin's sound but Zeppelin. Ironic considering the circumstances. Led Zeppelin II was engineered by Andy Johns, George Chikantz, Chris Huston, and the Vinyl Monday MVP, Eddie fucking Kramer. Roll transition. Alright, so, Led Zeppelin 1. If you're gonna say some dumb shit like, oh, there was no Led Zeppelin 1, just like people say there was no Led Zeppelin 4, shut up. No one cares. Literally no one cares. Zeppelin 1 was recorded hastily in the back half of '68, released in early '69, and makes waves as soon as it drops. Literally everyone has the name Led Zeppelin on their lips. Even George Harrison is talking about it in the Get Back sessions. But what Zeppelin didn't bank on was being such an immediate success in the United States. Atlantic Records certainly didn't expect Zeppelin 1 to be quite the smash hit that it was in America, but once they checked their bank account balances, they immediately ordered the follow-up. How immediately? An Atlantic Records exec interrupted the gold record certification party of Zeppelin 1 to pull Jimmy Page aside and ask for a follow-up by the end of the year. Jimmy knows it's a huge ask, but he says challenge accepted. We're looking at the busiest time in Led Zeppelin history right now. Zeppelin 2 was recorded through pretty much non-stop touring. A big chunk of the material and the sounds they were incorporating were influenced by their time in America. What they've also been doing is these extended jams through their live shows. Dazed and Confused had always been a longer one, but they're really drawing stuff out now. Jamming on Garnet Mims's As Long As I Have You bore not one, not two, but three of the songs on Zeppelin 2. What Is and Never Should Be, Ramble On, and the riff of Whole Lotta Love. Whole Lotta Love came first, then What Is and Never Should Be. These were both cut in April of '69 in London. These songs kick off the long but sporadic sessions for Zeppelin 2. Another live show staple was Bonzo's drum solo. This evolved from The Girl I Love, She Got Long Black Wavy Hair, which they performed at a BBC session in June. So we've got two essential components of Zeppelin 2 down now. A very busy schedule, and lots of jamming. The third was their main engineer while in the United States, Eddie Kramer. He'd worked on all three of the Experiences records, most recently the Herculean effort of Electric Ladyland. Eddie gets a call from Zeppelin's office in the States saying, hey man, the guys are in town, they have to slam out another record by the end of the year, are you in? Eddie says something to the effect of challenge accepted. Kramer's work with Zeppelin was chaotic but thrilling. He was following the tour schedule, getting the guys in any studio he could, making recordings in hallways. It sounds like he was chasing the guys around with a suitcase in one hand and a microphone in the other. This might not be too far from the truth, because at this time, Zeppelin was traveling with a big trunk of their tapes. They didn't have time to go drop them off in London. Songs would be started in one studio and finished in 2 or 3 others. Forgive me if I mess some of this up. This is a lot to keep track of, and I'm just gonna read it from my notes. We have Whole Lotta Love and What Is and Never Should Be at Olympic Studios in London. Then Thank You and She's Just a Woman at Morgan Studios in London. Additional work on Whole Lotta Love, as well as the Lemon song, takes place at A&M Studios in LA. Mystic Studios in LA gets more work on the Lemon song, plus Ramble On and Bring It On Home. Mayfair Studios in New York City, we have additional work on What Is and Never Should Be, and some work on Moby Dick. Groove in New York City continues work on What Is, and a little bit on Thank You. Juggy Sound in New York City, Ramble On. Atlantic in New York City, Heartbreaker. And Heartbreaker and Whole Lotta Love were finished at A&R in New York City. This is where the mix was done over August 29th and 30th. Neither Eddie nor Jimmy knew what to fill the middle space of Whole Lotta Love with, so they just twist every knob and push every button to see what happens, and we got this. Oh, and the harmonica for Bring It On Home was tracked at R&D in Vancouver, Canada. The guys nicknamed this place The Hut for how small and shitty it was. So for those of you keeping track at home, Led Zeppelin II was pieced together at 10 different studios, half of which were in New York. These engineers were putting in the work. Frequent stopping and starting over several months meant that these songs were evolving as they were being recorded. Take Moby Dick, for example. I thought for sure that all would have been done in one shot, in one place, but no, it was spliced together from multiple takes at Mystic Studios and Mirror Sound. The band's gear was changing too. Halfway through production, Jimmy switches from his Dragon Telly to a 1959 Les Paul. He bought it off Joe Walsh of the James Gang and brought it into the studio for the first time during Zeppelin II sessions. It's funny that two of his most famous instruments were hand-me-downs. Now, Jimmy had done this thing in a late-stage Yardbird session with Mickey Most. You might remember him from the Sunshine Superman video. That's a throwback! And he wanted to do it again. He brings the backwards echo idea to Eddie, and they make it happen for the middle section of Whole Lotta Love. There's also plenty of flanging and general studio goofiness going on. Eddie brought that in for stuff like What Is and Never Should Be from working with Hendrix. As much of an architect of sound as he was, pushing available technology to its absolute limits, Eddie wasn't at all obsessed with sonic perfection. He left the hiccups in. It added to the vibe. For example, someone coughs in the very beginning of Whole Lotta Love. You could very easily scrub this out of the final recording, but Eddie left it in. He had the guys record live whenever their facility's space would allow it. That echo at the end of Lemon Song was captured live. Of course, when you're recording with this naturalistic approach, there are gonna be some mistakes that you want to edit out, but you can't. There was this pesky leaked vocal through Whole Lotta Love that they couldn't do anything to cover but crank the reverb all the way up. All the lyrics on Zeppelin I were either adapted from blues tunes, oh, we'll get to that, or written by Jimmy. By 1969, Planty had started writing his own songs. He writes Thank You as an ode to his wife, Maureen. There's a reference in there to Stand By Me, a song that she loved. Plant was also a big ol' nerd who loved his books. He started incorporating his love of J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings into songs, starting with Ramble On. This begins the long and storied tradition of Zeppelin and fantasy Lord of the Rings references. I don't know how much longer these feathers are going to last. They're getting a little warm, but I had to keep them on for the section of the video. Okay, now all of this globe-trotting meant a revolving door of young women. Not girls. We're not there yet. That still takes a couple years. One of these women out in LA was Miss Pamela. She took such joy in styling Led Zeppelin. She would take them shopping, lend them some of her stuff, and she made clothes for the guys. See the pink and white velvet fringe number Jimmy's wearing here. Jimmy took such a liking to her that he went over to her apartment to play her the test press of Zeppelin II. He had to go in a hurry, though, and left it at her place. Being a GTO never made any of the girls, including Pamela, individually wealthy, so she had to sell this copy and a lot of other priceless rock and roll memorabilia to get by before she wrote I'm With the Band. This is my personal message to whoever has Pamela's copy. Name your price. Name your motherfucking price. I will take out a loan. Anyway, the track listing of Led Zeppelin II goes as follows. Opening up side 1, we have Whole Lotta Love, followed by What Is and Never Should Be. Then the Lemon Song, and side 1 is closed out with Thank You. Opening up side 2, we have Heartbreaker, which goes right into Living Loving Maid with the subtitle She's Just a Woman. I have never heard anyone actually call this song Living Loving Maid. I've only heard people call it She's Just a Woman. Then Ramble On. Next, Moby Dick, and the album closes with Bring It On Home. Led Zeppelin II was released October 22nd, 1969 here in the US, and a week later in the UK. UK. This wasn't even 9 months after their debut. And if you really want your mind blown, Zeppelin II came just a couple weeks after King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, and just about 6 weeks after the Beatles' Abbey Road. Atlantic ignored Zeppelin's no singles rule to put out an abridged version of Whole Lotta Love. That breaks the top 5 here in the US, with the LP hitting #1 both here and in the UK. A good chunk of these songs became live show staples, including Moby Dick, which would be stretched out over like 15-20 minutes, and Whole Lotta Love. The latter was performed at, if I'm not mistaken, every single show they played from 1970 to their last show in 79. Alright, so, Robert Johnson, Howlin' Wolf, and the Lemon Song. I saved this for this section of the video because there's always so much to unpack here. So the Lemon Song is mostly a reworking of Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor. This wasn't the first time Zeppelin had pulled from Howlin' Wolf. How Many More Times off Zeppelin 1 was written as a jam on How Many More Years. But the Squeeze My Lemon line, which has become so synonymous with Zeppelin over the years, came from Robert Johnson's Travelin' Riverside Blues. I believe the Lemon Song was the first Zeppelin tune to get the guys in song credit legal trouble. The company that owned Howlin' Wolf's music at the time sued for credits/royalties. They settled out of court. Then you get Willie Dixon, The Small Faces, and Whole Lotta Love. The lyrics borrow from Willie Dixon's You Need Lovin', which Muddy Waters also recorded. Zeppelin had pulled from Dixon's stuff a lot. See, You Shook Me, which also worked in the lick from Elmore James's The Sky Is Crying. I don't get many people mentioning that. I Can't Quit You Babe was also Dixon, and Bring It On Home on this record. Dixon took the surviving members of Zeppelin to court in the 80s for royalties/credits and won. I'm always hesitant to call Zeppelin outright thieves for this stuff because there's a lot of nuance that a lot of people miss. Did they follow the blues tradition of reworkings of standards to pay respect to the greats? Absolutely. Did they do some shady shit with their song credits? Also yes. But did Robert Plant totally steal Steve Marriott of the Small Faces' voice? Yes. Listen to their rendition of You Need Lovin', and it is loud and clear. So I don't want to hear shit about Josh Kiska's 2017 voice because that voice wasn't even Robert Plant's. For those on both sides of Zeppelin's tricky relationship with the blues, I get a flurry of comments from either side every time I unpack this in a video, which is a lot. I've covered Zeppelin a lot on this channel. It gets sticky in the beginning there, but everything after is done as a nod to those who came before. Like what had happened with Zeppelin 1, there was a pretty steep divide in reception of Zeppelin 2 between the fans and the critics. John Mendelsohn saved up some great quips for this one. He said Plant sang notes only dogs could hear, and alluded to having to be on serious drugs to withstand listening to this so many times. Please seek out this review if you haven't. It's absolutely worth the read. I get a great laugh out of it. But he did give credit where credit was due. You've got to admit that the Zeppelin has their distinctive and enchanting formula down stone cold, man. Like, you get the impression they could do it in their sleep. And it's interesting that he brings up that Blue Cheer record with the title that I can't pronounce, let alone spell. I held that jacket up last week in the King Crimson video. John said Whole Lotta Love was the heaviest thing he'd heard since Parchment Farm. Can't help but wonder if he'd heard Got to Ignore Evil Temptation, though. Iron Butterfly blew Blue Cheer and Zeppelin out of the water with that one. I will go to bat for Iron Butterfly like few other people will, but tangents aside, what do I think of Zeppelin 2? So going in the summer of 2019, about 50 years after their debut, I worshipped Led Zeppelin. I'd inherited my copy of Zeppelin III that spring. It's a pretty challenging Zeppelin record to start with, honestly. And I'd hunted down the rest of the 4 by July. The last one I found was Zeppelin 1. It was like finding the freaking Holy Grail. I played the hell out of these 4. I wasn't quite advanced enough yet to respond to Physical Graffiti or Houses of the Holy. The t-shirts never stayed out of the wash for long because I wore them whenever they were clean. This photo of Jimmy was my phone wallpaper for years. I have such a type, it's a problem. And one of my lesser nicknames in college was Plant. The major nickname was White Kanye. We don't talk about that. That was a dark time. The point is, Zeppelin's music had woven itself into the fabric of who I was as a person. It's funny, last week we had In the Court of the Crimson King, an album that is almost entirely divorced from the blues tradition, and now we have Led Zeppelin II, which clings onto the blues tradition so long it leaves claw marks. Zeppelin would be nothing without the blues. I have this bullet point in my notes simply titled, All Hail Eddie Kramer. I think why I like him so much on Zeppelin II and Electric Ladyland is that he wanted to capture groups in the studio naked as they came. The way Eddie's talked about recording Zeppelin 2 reminds me of how Jack Antonoff talks about recording Lana Del Rey. Jack leaves in all of the incidental stuff. You can hear Lana laughing, checking her phone, hitting her vape. He's said that every noise she makes inspires him. And I get that vibe with Eddie Kramer and the guys he recorded. Jimmy Page was one of the 2 guitarists that made me fall in love with guitarists, with guitar playing. I loved Jimmy when I was 20. Oh, I loved him so much. Guitarists exist on a spectrum of fluid to rigid and on an axis between solos guy and riffs guy. Jimmy is a riff machine on this thing. Whole Lotta Love, Lemon Song, Heartbreaker, Bring It On Home. But on the spectrum of fluid versus rigid, he is all the way on the side of rigid. This is an interesting combo when you consider his technique is far from pristine. Dare I say sloppy. If you're a fluid player and your technique is sloppy, you can hide it with a little do-do-do-do thing. Jimmy is a rigid player. He can't do that, but it never feels like he's fucking up because A, he just rolls with it and incorporates the hand slips in, and B, he had some great engineers on his side. Others might try and scrub Jimmy's playing clean. The guys on Zeppelin 2 didn't. Take the Lemon Song, for instance. Jimmy flubs this first lick pretty hard, but Chris Huston left it in. Does it feel like a flub unless you're listening really hard like I had to do for this video? No, it doesn't. Zeppelin 2 is an example of the band building on an already wonderful chemistry. You have to remember that back in the Zeppelin 1 days, Zeppelin had only been Zeppelining together for a couple months before heading into the studio. It's the summer of 1969 now, they've been together for about 8 months, and the guys have gotten to know each other as musicians. Jimmy isn't attached at JPJ or Bonzo's hip. He switches between playing with one or the other. What is and never should be is a great interplay between Jimmy and Bonzo. I appreciate a guitarist that can let his bassist breathe. And as they're refining their craft, with Planty in particular, we get these really cool glimpses across the Zeppelin 2 songs of him refining his voice. Are there some rough spots? Of course there are. He's still figuring out the whole singing thing. I don't think he reaches his vocal peak until Zeppelin 3. A Whole Lotta Love and What Is and Never Should Be are especially rough. But then you have the charisma oozing from the Lemon Song, and she's just a woman, and the crippling sincerity of Thank You. For the rest of this, review. It still feels so wrong calling what I do that. I'm breaking it up between songs I liked when I was in the thick of my Zeppelin phase and the ones I like now. The songs I loved then were Whole Lotta Love and Heartbreaker / She's Just a Woman. I consider Heartbreaker and She's Just a Woman one song because the grooves are so close together. Radio did the same in the 70s, and they still play these two as a unit today. And I liked them because, well, they were the bluesy riffy songs. Guitar do thing. The two songs I like most now are the biggest departure from what Zeppelin was known for and most often doing at this time. Starting with What Is and Never Should Be. It always takes me a while to settle into this one. This is a song where it's clear it was pieced together between a few different jams, and it's intriguing. The watery tremolo on these vocals are sick as hell. The other song I've warmed up to is Thank You. Clearly George Harrison hadn't heard this one before lamenting that Zeppelin had no ballads. You know, lyrically, with the white boy blues stuff on here, Whole Lotta Love, Lemon Song, you know what to expect. Thank You broke the mold. As sweet as the Stand By Me references are on here, this was the line that hit me. Inspiration's what you are to me. Inspiration, look, see? That was a line I had to grow up to appreciate. I will say this line in every single Zeppelin video. JPJ was the MVP of Zeppelin. The organ throughout Thank You makes the song special. There's some really beautiful flourishes happening, especially when we get to the medieval bit, that slight drone under, I use a quote because it's not imposing at all, with the organ happily trotting off into the sunset. That's something left over from the psychedelic 60s that Zeppelin carried into the 70s really well. Fantasy became a cornerstone of this band. This song, the other Lord of the Rings songs, the song remains the same cutscenes. I'm just not crazy about Ramble On, though. I never have been. As I've grown to appreciate a drummer, I have grown to appreciate Moby Dick. You have to pack your patience for this one, but it's an exercise in everything Bonzo could do. Two of his best moments, here and Since I've Been Loving You off Zeppelin 3, are when he pulls back and then hits you with these bursts. You don't normally associate the word restraint with Bonzo, and I still wouldn't. The butterfly that beats his wings and then causes a hurricane. His playing's like that. Oh, the Lemon Song. If Zeppelin had just called this song what it is, The Killing Floor, they would have been fine. If they'd done that, this song would have been remembered as an inventive cover of Killing Floor. When I look at this song through that lens, it's one of the best songs here. So many of the record's best moments are packed into these... Hold up, this is 6 minutes? Zeppelin closers are 50-50 for me. Sometimes you get great closers, like How Many More Times, When the Levee Breaks, The Ocean, and sometimes you get Hats Off to Roy Harper. Bring It On Home is okay as far as Zeppelin closers go. It's fine enough, but it's nowhere near as bad as they could get. Remember when I said earlier that I basically made liking Led Zeppelin a personality trait when I first discovered them? I think a lot of us classic rock girlies can relate to that. I made a point of that because it contextualizes how baffling this next bit of information is going to be. As many hours as I spent with those first 4 albums, I put in nearly 100 hours with them in 2019 alone. I couldn't remember which one was my favorite. So I went into this thinking, Abby, are you kidding? You've spent literally hundreds of hours with Led Zeppelin's music, and you can't remember which one was your favorite? Listening to Zeppelin 2 for this video, I realized, oh my god. This was my favorite back then. Led Zeppelin 1 was a shaky takeoff. It was a band in flux, still trying to figure out how to be a band, still trying to figure out how not to be the Yardbirds. Though Zeppelin II was clearly not their debut, it's the first album where they feel like a fully formed Zeppelin. They put in a lot of hours together, they had a great team chasing them around while they put in those hours, and it shows. I know I've used this line before, but I don't care. This makes this sound like a collection of demos. Though they're still firmly blues guys, they're taking what they've got and molding it into something more eclectic, more varied, rife for the mythology to come. Though their relationship with the blues was sticky, they took sonic tropes from the 60s and freshened them up a bit. Led Zeppelin II was their take two, the launch pad to becoming the biggest rock and roll band of the 70s. My personal favorites are the Lemon Song, Thank You, Heartbreaker / She's Just a Woman, and Moby Dick. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That's Led Zeppelin II, the conclusion of the Vinyl Monday 1969 miniseries, and we have just 2 episodes left of Season 2 of Vinyl Monday. What do you think of this album? What do you think of Led Zeppelin? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And if you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!